Okay, so let's start. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. It's really a big pleasure to have with us Juergen Gall. He is really well known for his research for the past many years on human behavior, forecasting, understanding, and so on. And he's been a professor at University of Bonn for the past probably more than 10 years. He was around in the Saarland University of Max Planck Institute and in ETH Zurich. Um, he received the ERC starting grant and the ERC consolidator grant. So I think he's very, very well known in the computer vision community. So looking forward, Jürgen, to see your latest results.
Yeah, so thank you for your invitation. As you can see in the title, it's a very long title actually for this 45 minutes. So we'll just briefly touch some of the aspect, but I also try to give a little bit some background in case if you're a little bit less familiar with some kind of the techniques, because this is also a form of an e-lecture. So let's directly jump into the topic. So what you can see here in the video, this is one of the examples where we actually first, before forecasting the behavior of persons, we want to a little bit understand what's going on from video data. And what you can actually see here in this video, so at the bottom, you have the color of the so-called the ground truth. So this is kind of the labels what you see, which called defined here with the correct part. So this is the action which are happening in the video. So this is like an assembly task. And at the second row here, ours, that's just kind of example what the model is actually predicting. So it tries to predict for each frame what activity is actually going on. So let's have now a look how we can actually build such a model and how this kind of model actually evolved a little bit over time. So the first setup, if you want to have a relative light model, one of the major aspects, if you want to understand such kind of the video, when we talk about long videos, about 30 minutes or longer, is you need to have a very long temporal receptive field. And one simple approach based on convolutions to obtain a very large receptive field are so-called delayed convolutions. And here, just like over time. And the nice property is, if you look like at a single output, just like at a single frame for the output, when we make a prediction, just think about the class probability of the activities. If you look at the dilation factors where information is taken into account, it's actually taken the entire sequence. And you see it like for each of the layers, you see actually there's a larger gap between this kind of the nodes, and this is exactly the dilation factors. And this types of the network is what we actually can use also to understand video data. So one of the approaches what we also developed was called a multi-stage temporal convolution network, because it had actually one important aspect, because if you just add more and more layers, so you see it here, dilation factor 1, dilation factor 2, dilation factor 4, and so on, adding more layers, this actually did not really improve the results. Therefore, at some point, what actually is very important, you actually have to do a so-called a reset, which means like after the first stage, you have like your loss, which is just like the standard loss is like, which means for each of the frames. So D is the annotation of the frame, C is the class label of the ground truth label, and then actually you want to actually predict what is the probability that you make a correct prediction by the network. And on the right-hand side, this is exactly the building blocks what I see. So it's a standard delayed convolution. So over time, and then a standard rectifier linear unit, a 1 times 1 convolution to reduce the number of feature channels, and then a skip connection. However, in order to make it work, what we actually did is like we actually reset the dilation factor after some layers, and that we actually see. So we increase the dilation factor 2, 4, 8, and so on. And this point, again, we reset it, and then starting with the dilation factor with 1, 2, 4, and so on. And we add this kind of the multiple stages, and in each of the stages, we actually have the loss as before to make sure that actually trains to make the correct prediction of the ongoing activity for each of the frames. So there are very different flavors how we can actually construct kind of a network. So it's a moment before I mentioned we just like start with small dilation factor and increase it over time. But you can also say it's like you want to have multiple branches at the beginning. So in this case, we start with small dilation factors, make them larger and larger. And on the left branch, we do it the other way around. We start with a large dilation factor and make them smaller and smaller. And they are actually then combined by just concatenating the feature representations and then continue for the next layer. So in this way, we actually give the network the opportunity to actually choose what's actually more important, to have a large dilation factor from the beginning, directly start with a large receptive field, or actually allow the network first have a small receptive field, and then step by step increase the temporal context to make a prediction. So this video shows some kind of the results. So again, the lowest row is always an indicator of the ground truth. And you see it actually, there's not a big difference between the approaches. Just like here, we have a change of the color. So it's like it mixes it up using the pepper and the salt. But this is kind of an example where we actually do some kind of the prediction of this kind of the video, and the two network with different kind of structure, the difference is actually not that big. So in reality, the main difference is like when you have only one stage or two stages, then you would see a bigger difference in performance. But as soon as you have multiple stages, like 3 or 4, then both type of the networks architecture actually perform very similar. And that video, what you can see here, that's like a data set called 50 salads. As the data set describes it, is like a sequence where people actually prepare some kind of salads in different videos. And the goal is always like to predict the different video sequences. And as you can see, like at the beginning, at the end, it's just nothing happening. And always don't forget to take a picture of the food, which is actually part of the data set. So now, what we also want to do, so not only take the temporal convolutions, but the question is also a little bit, so what is actually happening if we actually use a transformer architecture for the same task, what I've mentioned before. So vision transformers, most of you, I'm pretty sure, are familiar, but just for the students here who are not that familiar with the transformer architectures, just like the main idea in a nutshell. So in principle, you have video data or you have an image data, and what you do is like you represent the image here in this case by a set of patches. So here indicated by the different patches, which are then later on projected into a vector form. And what you also append is this number 1, 2, and 3. That's the so-called position encoding, because you want to know where this patch actually is coming from. And this kind of the features that you actually feed into so-called the transformer encoder. And what you get a representation of a set of tokens. So this is just your number of patches, in this case 196, and each of the token is represented by a feature of a certain length. So in our case, we talk about video, so the tokens correspond to the different frames, but we also then for each of the frames, we learn so-called representation. So now the question what we a little bit ask is like, if you want to analyze a video, let's say 30 minutes, do we actually need to model the context of the entire video? Because what is actually happening in a transformer architecture, you compute the attention between of the tokens. So in our case, if you want a prediction at this kind of the part, do we actually need to know the relation, what's actually happening at the beginning and at the end of the video? Or it's actually enough to just look at a small part of the video to make actually a correct prediction. However, there's one problem, because if you take like a vanilla attention module, you have the issues because technically in order to compute the attention, you need to compute so-called the self-attention matrix. And this has one of the property technically, so that the size of this matrix is n+1 times n+1 or n times 1. It depends actually on the number of tokens. And if you think about that each of the frame is a token, we talk about a 30 minutes video recording 30 frames per second. So we are more than 10,000 tokens and even larger. So just computing a naive attention over all the video frames, that is actually too expensive that we can actually not do. And just think about compared to language. So language, always here we have words. They also need to model like a larger context. But if you move on to the video, we have the issue that each frame is kind of a token. So we have to be very careful how we actually spend our computational resources. So before I a little bit explain how you can still compute the entire context of the entire video sequence, we actually wanted to ask the question, what I mentioned before, if I have a long video, do you really need the entire context of the video to make a correct prediction to not actually understand what's going on in the middle of the video? And this is actually what we a little bit analyzed. So if you want to look a little bit more, so the reference is in the bottom. But in a nutshell, technically, if you look at the results, so what we actually did is like we reduced or limit the amount of context what a model can actually take. So 12% means like the maximum context what we actually take in account to make a prediction for a frame is only 12% of the video. And then obviously we increase it to 50. And also like 100% means like we take the entire context of the entire video and we process videos of different lengths. Therefore, we take everything in relation to the entire video. And if you just look at the qualitative results, you probably recognize that if you have this 100% context, you're actually getting much closer if you compare the colors of the bars for the ground truth prediction. So in a nutshell, technically, it's like, yes, even like simple, like in language or in video processing, the larger the context what it take, the more accurate will be your prediction. So this is one of the results what we actually have actually shown, which is not surprisingly, but now I want to come back how we can actually compute now the entire context if you have a very long video. So if you have limited resources and you want to compute this kind of the attention, you have the standard approach. You actually divide your long sequence into small windows. So that you can see here. So this is, let's say, your entire video sequence. You have the frame 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. So this is just like a toy illustration. But now what you do is like you divide your sequence into smaller parts, so-called windows, here indicated by the color. So for instance, like the first frames, you put all the tokens of the first frames together, and then you compute the attention, which means like the attention between each of the frames, and that gives you an update of this representation. And you do the rest also for the other kind of the patches. So also here, again, for the purple one, you compute the attention, update this kind of the features. And at the end, you actually combine all this kind of the updated tokens again in the same sequence, and then you update your representations. But this doesn't model any global context because what you do is like you just divide it into small pieces, and for the small pieces there you compute the attention. Another approach to do it is you can actually subsample the sequence. So we have the same subdivision. So we have our entire sequence of all my frames. And now what I actually do is like I subsample my sequence. So if again use the number, so frame 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. So now at the end, what we do is like we subsample the sequence. So I take the first frame here, the second frame there, then the third frame here, and frame number 4, 5, 6, and so on. So that means like now what we have is like a sequence subsampled in time, because in this toy example, we take only every second frame, but we still have all the frames, but actually like separated and shifted by one of the frames. And again, as before, for this sequence, we can compute the full attention. So attention between all the frames of our subsampled sequence, updating the features of each of the tokens, and then again, reorder them in the same order as before. And we get also like an update of my sequences. So now I have actually two operations. The local window computes like my full attention, but only like of neighboring frames. And this long-term context computes the context of the entire sequence, but temporal subsampled with a lower temporal resolution. So now the idea is now straightforward. If you combine these two approaches, attention in a single network, then you do actually both. The local context, this gives you like the global context with a low temporal resolution. And then the immediate step, you actually update your tokens using the local context, but with the full temporal resolutions. So these steps are a little bit seen here. So at the end, you have the local temporal window context, then you apply the long-term context, and this is actually then iterated, though you always iterate between update, global context, and local context with full temporal resolution. And as we show in the paper, so this actually really improves the accuracy for the temporal action segmentation part. So this is also some kind of result. So here I focus a little bit more, what is the impact, how you actually limit the amount of context for the provide to the system. So again, you have the notation. Full means like we computed, as I mentioned before, over the entire sequence, the attention, and if I say 50%, 25%, or 12%, so we artificially reduce, so the maximum context what the network is allowed to use is just like a percentage of the frame. And if you compare this kind of the results, so you see the different colors correspond to different actions, you actually also recognize that the full context actually gives a better prediction. And this is like from the what I mentioned at the beginning, the assembly data set. So this is like a public available data set where people assemble or disassemble toys, and the actions are actually very fine-grained. So this is just like another example showing the same of the impact from the video sequence what was shown before is on the data set where people actually prepare different types of salads, and you also have the top view. Also here we can actually see that the color alignment between these estimates actually better if we actually have the full context of the entire video sequence. So we'll just play the video at the end that I can actually look what kind of actions are actually predicted. So it's just showing here the ground truth, but you see this alignment of the different actions, and the black line is just like the count frame, which you see in the video. So this was so far just understanding what's actually going on. And however, in many kind of application, that's not enough, right? So if you think about you want to have, let's say, a robot interacting with a human, it might perfectly understand what the person is doing, but it also needs to anticipate what will the person actually doing next. So in this example, you see kind of a robot, what we actually have here at the University of Bonn, and it actually wants to help the student to actually put a jacket on. And you see it like the right hand of the person is already a little bit damaged. Maybe it's a little bit kind of broken. But you can a little bit imagine if the robot doesn't really anticipate the motion of the left hand of the person, probably the left hand after this action will also be broken, which is not the desired output. So at the end, it's very important to really not only predict what's actually going on, but anticipate what is the next movement, what is the next motion. And I just want to mention one approach, what we did in this direction, where we actually is the goal to actually predict the motion of the future behavior. This ASA can be at the level of actions. So that's what you can see here. So that means like you have a sequence as a given. So this is exactly your input. And now it's like that's the only input to the algorithm. And now what I'm showing, it's also the video, but this is not what the person actually gets. So the only thing what you want to predict is actually what are the future actions, what's happening. So this is one task of the forecasting where you actually try to predict the future actions. And the other task of the forecasting is where you actually want to forecast the human motion. So we see like the dark color is the observations. And when the videos change to the bright color, yellow and bright green, that's like the future actions. And in one example is in partly interesting if you have multiple persons interacting with each other, because in most cases, right, when we have like interactions, being it robot and humans or humans and humans, there's a lot of social interaction happening between the persons. And this is exactly what you also want to model is like when you do the forecasting, not like predicting the motion of a single person, but predicting the motion of multiple persons at the same time. So to do this kind of prediction, we actually follow a diffusion model. So the diffusion model, just in case if you're not very familiar with it, they are actually relatively straightforward. So we actually have two directions. So if you have, for instance, like an image, you have so-called a forward process, and it means like you add small kind of Gaussian noise until everything is just like represented as a Gaussian noise. So the zero mean and the occurrence matrix is symbol like the identity matrix. The interesting part, however, for generating motion or images is the other way around. So you start from sampled Gaussian noise, you have the reverse process, and then from the reverse process, you actually want to reconstruct a signal, which can be an image, can be video, or can be a human motion sequence. And the reverse process, this is something this is the difficult part. And there what the people actually do is like you go from any intermediate step like X4, and you actually want to slightly denoise in each of the step this input signal. And this kind of the transformation is done by a network. And the essential part is like how you actually design the network that you at the end get good results. So this is the setup. So technically what we have is like we have an estimate from the previous step. And now what we want to do is like at the diffusion step t-1, so you run actually multiple steps starting from t to 0, you actually want to actually reconstruct what would be the denoise signal, and then you apply it for several steps. And this network, technically, I will explain it on the next slide, but now in our case, we want to condition this step based on our observations. And the observations are the sequence of poses, what we have observed, and we also want to actually predict the future sequences, what we'll actually have in the future. So it's actually important to not only generate a sequence of the future, because you want to have a smooth transition between the observation and the future, because otherwise you actually might have a jump. But on the other hand, we know the observation. The observation, this does not change. And at the end, to do the conditioning, we do it in a relatively straightforward way. So what we actually do after diffusion step, we actually modify the signal. And what we do is like for the observation part, we simply override the denoise signal by our true observation, because that does not change. So that's a very simple way how we can condition the diffusion model based on some observation if you want to use it for the forecasting. So now I want to come to the network, and as I mentioned before, we use a relative lightweight network, again, based on the temporal delay deconvolutions, because remember, for the diffusion steps, we usually apply multiple steps for the denoising part. Therefore, we do not want a heavy network like a transformer architecture, but we go rather for like a lightweight network based on delayed temporal convolutions. So if you first look at a single person, so here at the single diffusion step, we have our sequence of poses, including the observed poses and the future poses. And now we have an encoder, which is based on some delayed temporal convolution. Here we actually have a bottleneck, so we reduce the temporal resolution, which gives us then the latent space, hi, as an immediate representation. And then again, we have a decoder, which is just like the inverse of my encoder, again, based on temporal convolutions. And then we get a denoised version of our time series consisting of the observed and future poses. So this is the network architecture for the diffusion model for a single person, and it's applied in a single diffusion step. So now if you move on to multiple persons, we now need to actually ensure that the motion of all the persons is consistent. And this is actually relatively straightforward to do. So let's say we have like 3 persons here, green, blue, and red. As before, we have a sequence for each of the person based on observed and future frames. And now what we do is like, again, our encoder maps it for each person into a Latin representation, here indicated by hi, j, and k. And now what we do is like we have an additional aggregation function. And this aggregation function actually takes the Latin variables of all the persons together and combines them. And this is then actually added as additional representation to my latent space. And then again, I feed both the aggregated function plus the individual hidden space to my decoder, and I generate an updated version of the sequence of each of the persons. So there's actually very different ways how we can actually define such kind of aggregation function. One of the simplest way what you can do is you simply average the Latin representations. But you can also use more sophisticated functions like cross-attention, which actually might be also relevant, and in some cases might give you better results. But even just like average this kind of a hidden representation always gives us some kind of a motion where the motion of the multiple person actually remains synchronized. So some of the data sets what we use, so one data set is actually for CMU, is so-called the Heckling data set. So this is like where people, they play some game. So what you see is like you have a buyer. So at the end, that actually wants to buy stuff, and you have always like 2 sellers, the left seller and the right seller, and they actually want to sell a product to the buyer. You also have the information who is actually speaking, and this black line, what you see in the video, that shows if the buyer is looking to the left or the right seller. So on which person the buyer is currently focusing. And this is an example of a data set what we actually used. So now what you see is like some of the results. So again, the dark color is the observation. Let's first look at a transformer-based architecture, what you see in the middle, and you see actually there's no motion happening. So the motion simply freezes this is actually happening for some of the approaches. They work very well for a very short time. So let's say like a few hundred milliseconds, but they start to freeze for longer periods. And that's actually not very nice. So now I'm playing the video again, and now we can actually look not at the transformer architecture, but we can actually look at the diffusion model. And if you're playing the observation, now it actually switches to the forecasting, and you see it continuously generates some kind of motion. It doesn't suffer from the freezing, and at the end, there's always some kind of nice interactions between the different persons. So we also analyzed in the paper, they're using kind of different metrics, and also shows that technically that the motion which generated is actually plausible given our training data. So we also applied some kind of other sequence, but I want to a little bit make it clear that some of the data sets are not very useful. So this is actually also some data sets which have been used before. And if you look at the motion, there's no really interaction between the persons. And this is actually not expected because this data set has been created in the way they used actually the CMU mockup dataset, which usually contains 1 or 2 persons, and then they simply randomly combined multiple sequence together, which shows, yes, there are 3 persons, but there's no interaction between the persons. So on this dataset, if you predict the person of each person individually or of all the persons together, there's actually no difference because there is no really interactions between the persons. And since actually there was strong limitation in the data set, so the Hackling data set, what I've mentioned before, there's nice social interactions, but the persons are not moving, right? They're always standing at the same location because they have captured in a small dome. Their capture area was relatively small, so they cannot really run around or something like. And in this kind of the data set, what is just shown here, there is much more motion. People are moving around, but there's not much interaction. This was actually the motivation for us to also collect the data set where we actually have realistic interaction between the person in a realistic environment, and also having close interactions but also moving persons. And this data set is called Humans in Kitchen because it actually has been recorded in kitchen environments, but actually a little bit larger areas. And you see it like 3 kind of the camera views for the see in this kind of the frames. And it has been recorded by set up multiple cameras. So you see the scenes from different views, and each of the poses, so the 3D poses, actually have been annotated. And one additional information what we have is also the 3D environment. So the first thing is like what you can see here on the top. So before doing the recording, we made a 3D scan of the environments. However, this is actually static, right? You do the 3D scan and then you do the recording for 2 hours, and some of the environment actually can change. Therefore, in addition, we also annotated some kind of the bounding boxes, like simple polygons of different kind of objects. So for instance, like the yellow one here, that's a whiteboard as an example, or here you can see like the blue one, that's a table, and we also have chairs. And if you now play the video here on the right-hand side, you actually see why we actually did these annotations, because if you look closer, partly here where the tables and the chairs are, you will see at some point people move around the chairs and place them at a different kind of location. So it's actually very important if you want to model the context of the scene that you also take into account that the scene, the environment can change, people move things a little bit around, and we actually have this information in this data set. So these sequences are quite long, and I show just like having now the next videos where just like kind of statistics is exactly here's like what we have, like the recording, what we actually have is like different kind of the different locations, and then the recording is roughly between nearly 2 hours for most of the cases. But the most important is like, if you look at the maximum number of persons, so here in some of the kitchen, we have 16 persons at the same time. So there are a lot of kind of interactions. And the way how the data was collected, they were not really instructed, like do a following action, but the information was like within 2 hours, you have one task, go to the kitchen and drink a coffee. So the participant could actually decide when they actually joined the scene, and some of the subjects in the videos, they didn't even get any instructions. We also have some additional information. So this is just like showing some kind of the scenes, because we also have the geometry, what I mentioned before. And here you see like different kind of persons where someone is explaining something at the whiteboard, where the other people are listening, or in the other scene, you see people actually chatting in the kitchen. So this is two examples from two environments. And here on the next video is like two other scenes what you see. And this is actually a bit larger than kitchens. So there's also like a sitting area with a whiteboard outside. So people also are moving between the kitchen and the environment, entering the scene, and also leaving the scene. So we also have additional information. So we have not only the 3D poses, we not only have the 3D environment, we also have the activities. So where you can now visualize from a top view, for instance, you can query, okay, where actually have been the person when they were actually walking, which is like, obviously, if you go from place A to B, you're always walking. And then you see this kind of the yellow lines give kind of like a overview where persons actually moved inside of the kitchen. And here at the bottom, you see another example. So when actually did some actions using the sink, which is like here, just like the red line is like circular indicating where to actually look. And you see it like the yellow one is again, where have been the position when they actually do like dishwashing or washing the dishes or did anything else at the sink. So at the end, we also have the information of when certain activities are actually happen. And this gives us a nice idea to visualize what actions they're actually doing in this environment. So the data set is available. You need to actually sign kind of a license, but you can use it for 3D pose estimation from a single view, for multiple person tracking, forecasting, or whatever you actually want to do with this data set. So I also want to, going back to the examples, instead of forecasting motion, is also forecasting activities. And also here, we also use the diffusion model, because diffusion models, what is the nice property? You not make a single prediction from your observation, you can actually make multiple predictions. So again, our input is a video sequence, and technically everything here, that's like the future. And this is technically what is actually here. That's the observation. So that's what we actually observed in the video, what I can see in this video. And technically, because when we do a forecasting, so the future is uncertain, it's actually very important that we not make a single prediction, but we make a stochastic prediction predicting multiple future paths, which actually could be unfeasible. But the important aspect so far with the human pose estimation, we also use the diffusion model. So we also make multiple predictions, but the input was always like the ground truth 3D poses. However, if you do it directly from the video, there's also some uncertainty in our observed video data. So for instance, if you look at these frames, the light conditions are very bad, and there might be actually some ambiguity in our observed frames. And that technically means like it's actually not enough to just like to model the uncertainty in the future. We also need to model what kind of uncertainty we have in the observations. And that makes it much better to understand why we have certain predictions. So in this example, so at the end, there's kind of ambiguity because of the light conditions. If someone actually uses something with cereals or something preparing like a tea, or this is kind of related to preparing a hot chocolate. So at the end, because of the light condition, there's already a high uncertainty in our observed part. And this uncertainty also propagates to the future, where we also get different kind of predictions depending what our model actually understood from the observation. So the model, what we do, what I mentioned is again a diffusion model. So what we do is like we have our observed frames. So that's our input. And for the future frames, what we do is simple like zero padding. So we simply add from the beginning, everything just like with zero as an input. And what we also have like in any diffusion model, some noise. And this kind of the model, what it actually does, it makes the multiple predictions. So both for the observation part, as well as for the future frames, which initially have just been zero. So there's one kind of the property what we actually also exploit here, because if you want to do a long-term forecasting, so there actually are many frames in the future which are actually zero. So in some sense, it might actually better to just like allow the network to gradually adjust the information, how you propagate it from the observation to the future. And to give the network this flexibility, we introduced so-called gated convolutions, which is actually illustrated here. So what does it actually mean? We have a standard convolution. Just think about the temporal convolutions, what I mentioned before. So this exactly is this part. And now add a frame to decide if I take the information from the previous layer or not. We also have a gate. And gate always means like it predicts a value between the range between a 0 and 1. If I at the value is 0, which means like I do not take any information into account. And if it's 1, I simply take the full information what I get. And if you now look, what are the gates values, we see a clear pattern between what is happening in the observation part and what is actually happening in the future frames. So this is my observation part, and this is actually is my future. And here what you see is the visualization of the gate values. So yellow means the gate value is close to 1, and dark blue means like the value is actually close to 0. And if you look at there, we actually see that there's a pattern. The technique is like, at the beginning, there's actually just like some parts of the observation which are taken into account. And then later in the stage here, we also see that these patterns are actually changing of the gating values. So we see also that some of the channels, like this one here, some of them actually remain small, or sometimes always only the observation is actually used. So this actually shows that these gates actually they really adapt depending what is my observation, and they change over time when my information from the past is actually more propagated to the future. So this shows kind of examples. So when the video stops, so like this one, when the line becomes red, so this is like until my observation, and everything here that is actually like the forecasting of the futures of mobile actions. And you see in the top left, they're always like the action. So this is like another example. So at the end, here's actually a misunderstanding. So the ground truth is like here, the still means like there's nothing annotated as background. But it's actually a bit interesting here because it's like you see it's an orange. But in the data set, they distinguish between a fruit and an orange. So I'm actually not sure if sometimes orange is also annotated as a fruit, but it also results in some kind of ambiguity, because in the orange, in most cases, people squeeze the orange, while for the fruit, they maybe cut them or do something other stuff. But also here's like an example where we also get different predictions, both from the observation as well as for the future. We move on a little bit on. We're going to the next video. And this is like also for the assembly data set, also here. So that was the observation. And then it's like you actually tries to predict what are the future steps. And then at the end, the more we go in the future, we get slightly different predictions. But if you look also at the durations, so it also makes like a reasonable estimate what the durations of the future actions actually are. So one of the nice results is like to a little bit understand if the uncertainty in the observation, does it actually has an impact on my uncertainty, what I will have in the future. And this is like what you see in this plot here. So this x-axis, we actually divided the sequence depending how much uncertainty I have in my observation. And when we do it, we simply measure how consistent the prediction of my diffusion models are, for the observation part. That means like a high consistency, and that means like 75 to 100, there's a high uncertainty in my observation. And you see it like the y-axis, this is like the accuracy for the forecasting. And as expected, the higher the uncertainty is in my observation, there my lower the accuracy is in my future. This is like a nice behavior, but it's also expected. So for the rest of the time, I mentioned I have a very long title, so I just like want to briefly also some application which actually go beyond human behavior, but this is related to some kind of the forecasting part. And one example is exactly forecasting wildfires. So what you actually have as an input, so here we have like satellite data or meteorological data. So we have like meteorological data, satellite data, some information about the environment like altitude, and also some information of land cover, like is the river, lakes, buildings, forest, and so on. And now the task is actually you want to predict for the next day, what is like the probability that maybe a major wildfire will actually start. So this is like the example of your input data. And in this application, you have different types of data. You have some data which does not change over time, at least not for the period what we're looking, which is like elevation and slope. So this actually remains fixed. And we have other parameters like NDVI. So this is an index for vegetation, what you can obtain from remote sensing data. Then you have like the temperature during day and night, relative humidity. So you have some parameters which actually change hourly or very quickly. In order to combine both static and dynamic variables, what you do is like you can do it in a very efficient way where you have the dynamic variables, you have the static variables, and then you process them by different branches. So this at least is like here you have the dynamic, the time component, but you don't have this time component in your static variables. And at the end, at some point, you simply concatenate a branch and then you make a prediction for a wildfire start to be on the next day. That you can do, but it's not the most efficient way. Just think about temperature. There's a big difference if you have 10 degrees temperature in an altitude of 2,000 meters above the sea level or 400 meters above the sea level. So most of the dynamic variables, they strongly depend on the environment where you actually measure them. And we actually want to take this into account and also model this information. So what we actually do is like we have our dynamic features. So that's like temperature or other features. And now we modulate this kind of the features by multiplying by a learned factor and a constant term. But this is actually depending on the static features. So the static variables are denoted by S and the dynamic variables here, they're denoted by D. And in practice, from the implementation, is then relatively straightforward. So we have our dynamic feature maps, and we actually want to update them based on our static feature maps. And now we apply a few convolutions. Then at the end here, we extend along the time axis, just copying the values. This gives us the gamma. We multiply it at the constant term better, and that's the way how we can actually update and scale our dynamic features. So we add this kind of the modulation part in this kind of the network. So it's like at this part, and that means like at this kind of the part of my network, I actually like normalize my dynamic variables based on my static environment. So we actually show in the paper that this actually improves the prediction accuracy. I just want to show a few qualitative results. So this is actually an example of from 2020. So at the end, this is like an existing data set. So this is actually public available. So it's the region around Greece. And at the end, this black circles here, that means like there are recordings here. Actually, a wildfire actually started on the day. And the red is actually the prediction by the network. So here we see in August another example. So there are much more wildfires, but also like here, this heat maps the prediction. They also adapt and focus on the region where the wildfire actually started. So we have also examples from the year 2021. So in July, that's actually a nice example because here most of the map is green. There's actually mainly a region here which is red. And indeed, in this region, there also has been a major wildfire. And just like 1 month later, the wildfire season has its peak. And here you see like large maps are actually here's red. And we see it also many kind of the wildfires actually occurred in this kind of a sequence. So this is an example where we do the prediction just for the next day. Just the last application what I want to mention is like for long-term prediction. So now we do not want to have predict a wildfire for the next day, but we want to predict how agriculture droughts will we have for the next 2 years. So we have some data and we want to predict for the next 2 years what is actually the probability that we have agriculture droughts in Europe, because they actually become more and more important. So when we do the long-term predictions, so here we also utilize a simulation model. So a simulation model, what they do are like physical models. You run them based on many differential equations. And then you actually so-called the projection means like you make a prediction for the future for several years, in this case, just like for the next few years. However, this kind of the models, they do not contain all the variables. They have some variables, what they include, but for instance, like there's not a perfect coupling, for instance, like between the surface and the variables what you have in the atmosphere. However, from the surface, we also have information from remote sensing. So what we can actually do, we can take all the variables, what we have from simulation, like precipitation, soil moisture, and so on. And then at the end, we take like a machine learning approach to actually map it to some kind of remote sensing, which is an indicator of the health of the plants. And we can do it with data which is at the present, but we can also do it then with the data which the simulation has also predicted for the next few years. So what it actually does, so at the end, I have this kind of the model, and now the thing is like what we not predict is like first the NDVI. So what I mentioned is like an index of vegetation and the brightness temperature. So brightness temperature is an indicator of the health of the plant. So if the plants have a stress or not. And then from these two indices, you can actually compute the so-called drought index. So this is like a standard equation what we use in the literature, and this gives us the vegetation health index. So I'm skipping a little bit of the details here. You can actually look it up in the paper. So this is just a way how you compute if our network predicts the NDVI and the brightness temperature. So this actually gives us then the vegetation condition index and the thermal condition index. So just based on the equation there. And then from this, we actually can compute the vegetation health index, where red means like, okay, here we have a stress of the plants, and this green means like here, there's not a big issue of agriculture drought. So I will not jump directly to the last video, what I want to show, which is like playing here. So here you see the predictions. So what we have run a simulation, then we actually, from the simulation, we actually predict NDVI and brightness temperature. So this is not variables which are part of the simulation. And this is like showing what the prediction are, our Europe. And then both from the index, they actually combined to compute a vegetation health index. And red means, that means like, this is like a high probability of a drought, while the blue or the green color, everything is fine. There's not a big issue. And now what you actually see, so this is like a prediction 2 years ahead. So you see the results from remote sensing, and this is actually the prediction what our model gives. You would not expect that exactly in this week at the same location you have a prediction of the drought, but if you now compare the two results, we actually see that the patterns where we expect droughts, that this is actually quite close or similar what we actually observed in our remote sensing data. And this is actually a very nice result because it shows that with the simulation and also predicting using machine learning, we can actually make a prediction how droughts will actually change in the future, also taking account how certain changes based on the climate change actually will change this kind of patterns, what we already observe. And this is just like coming close to the end of the video. So you see it kind of red is like a high indicator, high probability, and you can actually make a side-to-side comparison between the remote sensing data and the prediction. And you can also a little bit look at in your history when actually certain drought events, heat waves actually occurred in the past, and then you actually see that all of them actually has been nicely predicted by the model. So at this point, I would simply say I'm stopping here, and I'm now looking for your 4 questions.
Thanks a lot, Juergen. Very, very inspiring, very nice. So questions? You can just talk directly or write them in the chat as you prefer. Let me start with one question. It was one thing that I really liked a lot. It's this motion anticipation when you have multiple persons. I was wondering, are you also modeling there some causal effects in the sense that, I don't know, I'm pushing you, you are going to fall, or this kind of things?
Yeah, so at the moment not. It's just taking or everything a little bit together. There has been another work at ECCV that actually doing in a way, in a sense that technically give you the motion of one person and then you forecast the motion of the other person. So there's some kind of recent work which actually has been published. So in this kind of work was shown here, we just like aggregate this kind of information. which takes the other person into account, but there's no explicit way to take like causal effect that at the end, if someone pushes, the other actually falls down. It's actually very likely that this would be also the case, what we see in the results, but we at the moment we simply aggregate them, though there's no causal direction in one or the other direction.
Right. So when you're using the causal stuff, maybe you may need to put in some sort of extra knowledge, some kind of physical models or some kind of
Yeah,
such things.
yeah, that's definitely that will be a potential extension, yes.
Mm-hmm. No, because related to that, I mean, when you have the human in kitchen data set, also there you may consider, let's say, the interaction of people with the objects, of course. And,
Yes.
and also there you need to have some sort of physical models if you need to. Otherwise, of course, you can always understand that, I don't know, a pen is done in a particular
Yeah.
way, but not everything.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually true. So at the end, we also had some kind of a small work in this kind of direction. And what we also a little bit observed, if we don't have the physical model, then sometimes people walk through the chairs. So ignoring the environment or as technically not walking directly on the ground. So at the end, with this kind of the data set, if you integrate the scene context, the interaction with different persons, causality, you can do a lot of things. And this data set, I think, is like a very helpful resource to actually exploit this information.
Mm-hmm. I was also wondering for the human in the kitchen data set, how much, so the analysis, how much it differs from, let's say, things like doing the first person view, like things that, other people have been doing, like Giovanni Farinella or, yeah, I mean, you know what I mean. So in the sense that if
Uh,
you have the camera worn by the person, then the view is a bit distorted.
Yes. So it depends. So some kind of, when it comes to just predicting the actions,
Mm-hmm.
so they actually most approaches actually they work actually for both scenarios. There's only one difference is a bit in the egocentric. Usually, they do not predict how long is the duration of the actions, which is also because you are looking a little bit different direction counterpart. But in most cases, if you go more for the short time prediction, it actually doesn't matter. The approaches which work on third perspective also work from the egocentric perspective in this kind of direction. But at the end, if it comes to it, when you have the interaction with multiple persons, then for the egocentric makes it a bit difficult because you probably don't see so much where the other person, they are out of the field all the time.
Precisely. So one of the things that indeed you have is that here you can have multiple persons and they can do more complex stuff. While for the
Yeah.
egocentric, so what Dima does, Dima Damen, they have some kind of
Mm.
very simple action. You just get the field of view of the person
Yeah.
and you see somebody washing whatever, and it's definitely more limiting in this respect. Okay. Any questions from the audience?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Gall. Um, I have a question. Like, when you motivate us that you try to use a human motion and forecasting that you want to enable human robot interaction. That's something
Yeah.
we need. So now we have some approach that we can anticipate or forecast human motion in the future. And then how can we enclose or so how can we close the final loop that we can include the robots to have the robots interact with us.
Yeah. So this work is kind of a collaboration with robotics groups at the University of Bonn. So it's kind of a small research unit. And they actually first, like we do this kind of the forecasting, and obviously you do the planning of the robots is also based on the kind of the forecast motion, kind of in this kind of the setting. So at the end, it also takes into account when you do the planning of the motion of the robots, you actually take into account what is like the forecast motion, and it depends a bit what is the time horizon. If I put a jacket, it's more important to have an accurate short time forecasting, but that's actually taken into account. So you run it on the robot, and the robot also forecasts the motion, tries to do the planning, and then adapts the planning if there's some kind of change in the motion. So we can actually integrate this on our robot platform.
Right, that's very interesting. So what should be the ground truth motion of the robots?
Yeah, well, there is no ground truth motion. So at the end, technically, so the way how we can actually measure is like how much time you actually need to do to complete this kind of the task. So this is more kind of like a demonstrator in kind of the way. So in some sense, you're a little bit asking, okay, if I have some kind of a task, how we could actually measure that my robot does the task in a better way. I think that's your question. Is it correct?
Yeah. I think it's good. Yeah, I understand. So we don't have the actual motion of the robot, but there's a task that the robot has to complete,
Yeah.
and then that has been used as the proxy or the final objective that we can achieve.
Exactly. So that's the way how we
Yeah.
can do it. I mean, you can also do it if you want to repeat it more in a simulation environment. But at the end, partly in this kind of part, you can also then make kind of concrete application and then have some kind of a task where a human and robot in collaboration with the anticipation, if we can solve the task in a faster way. So that's one way of a proxy how we can measure it.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Any other question? It seems not. So I think we are quite in time. So, well, thanks a lot, Juergen. And well, as I said, we're looking forward to seeing you again very soon.
Yeah. So thank you for the invitation.
Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Bye.
See you guys. Bye.